Jenkins from the New South Wales DPI Fisheries team that will be presenting. She's part of the Marine Estate Management Strategy's Oyster Reef Restoration Project, so very lucky to have her. We've also got Nerida Gill, who is a project partner with us and works for the Greater Sydney Local Land Services Group, so LLS, and she'll be here in support and potentially available to answer some questions, and I'll move through and let each of these people introduce themselves after I've done this brief introduction. Of course, myself, Kirk Dally, work with TNC, excuse me, and presenting tonight from Port Stephens and supported with by Paco here, who is also with TNC, and he'll introduce himself in a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off and let Paco say hello. He's the project manager for the Botany Bay and Georges River project. So go ahead and say hello and we'll work through our speakers and then move from there.
Thanks, Kirk. Hi, everybody. I'm Paco here. As Kirk mentioned, I'm the project coordinator of Botany Bay projects, and also I assist Kirk in different other projects that we have in New South Wales. And then also I am in charge of coordinating the monitoring and science for TNC in New South Wales. Thank you for the introduction. I'll pass into Simon Brannigan.
G'day everyone, I'm Simon Brannigan. I'm actually calling from Queenscliff outside of Melbourne, and I'm the operations manager for the Nature Conservancy, overseeing 6 of our reef builder projects on the east coast of Australia. And I'll maybe hand over to Charlie.
Thanks, Simon. Good evening, everyone. So yeah, I'm Charlie Jenkins with DPI Fisheries, and as Kirk said, I'm part of an oyster reef restoration team that's delivering a whole suite of actions under the Marine Estate Management Strategy. And part of that is a really fabulous partnership project that we've got with the Nature Conservancy and Greater Sydney Local Land Services for Botany Bay. So looking forward to this evening's presentations. Thanks.
Pass over to you, Nerida, if you'd like to do a brief introduction and go from there.
Good evening, everyone. I represent Greater Sydney Local Services. Our agency is a registered service provider and was therefore eligible to apply for funding from the Australian Government's Fisheries Habitat Restoration Program for this initiative by the Nature Conservancy and the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. So we're a project partner. Yeah. Our role is to report back to the Australian Government on the project milestones and outcomes, provide local knowledge and contacts for the project, and look for opportunities to value add to our other work in Botany Bay and its estuaries.
That's fantastic, Nerida. Thank you. All right, so once again, everyone, we've got this session being recorded. If you're just joining us now, light entries, please mute your microphones. We're going to go ahead and kick in. I'll do my last final introduction here. My name is Kirk Dally. I work with the Nature Conservancy as the Oceans Program Coordinator in New South Wales. And we'll walk through the project partners here. The first, we've got a partnership with New South Wales DPI, and that's through the New South Wales Fisheries Agency. We also have funding coming into the project from the Local Land Services through the National Fish Habitat Restoration Program, as Nerida mentioned. And then some major funding is also being contributed to this project through the Australian Government's partnership with the Nature Conservancy in the Reef Builder Initiative, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we move through the presentation. If you'd like to move forward, Paco, we'll look at the agenda. We've got a presentation broken down into a few parts tonight. We'll start off with a little bit of a background on Botany Bay and shellfish reefs in general, looking in depth at the ecosystem services they provide. Then we'll pass over to Charlie, who will provide a history of oyster reefs in New South Wales in general, and with some focus on Botany Bay. And then it'll pass back to me, and I'll give us a walkthrough of the actual project in Botany Bay. So a little bit of pre-information to get everybody up to speed and give the presentation context. And then at the end, again, we'll be taking questions throughout in the chat function. So please, if you have questions as we go, type them in there and we'll deal with them at the end. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand over to Paco, who will begin the presentation. Thanks, Paco.
Thank you. Well, I need to start this presentation with our lovely bay and river, Botany Bay, which I like to call it a bay of contrasts. And I think in this picture really represents what I'm talking about. We have a place where it's a very densely populated area, but still we have a fantastic a range of habitats that really contribute to the richness of the bay, while also having an amazing, incredible, huge industry and logistics areas in the same place. So yes, definitely a place where opposites meet, I would say. And with that, you know, I want to showcase one of the I guess most of these richness that we present in the bay, from the marine to the estuarine components. So here we have different habitats that we can find through the heads of the bay to Tora Point Reserve. We have amazing seagrass beds, we have kelp forests, we have sponge gardens, we have an amazing diversity, great fishing area, fantastic area for many different species with ecological, commercial, and recreational value in there. And, you know, moving towards the upstream areas, we find lovely bar sands, sand flats. We have marshes in Tora Point Reserve. We have mangrove forests that are fantastic and produce amazing nursery for juveniles. And we have some bits and pieces of what we call oyster reefs. Now, this is a natural part of the bay and that we all love and share, but we also have the human seascape, the components of one of the biggest ports in Australia, one international airport, we have industry, we have public beaches. So it's really an amazing area where different stakeholders, different natural components meet together. Fortunately, having this great component of a human seascape have some consequences for the natural seascapes. So over the years, Botany Bay has been a place where land reclamation and erosion has had a huge impact on natural habitats. Contamination and pollution has had a huge impact on these habitats that we have set, and habitat depletion and diminution of the area of this natural habitat have really impacted the richness of the habitats that the bay originally presented. And one of the habitats that we want to focus today, and this is the main reason of our project, is the loss, and at some point, is one of the habitats that have lost a major loss in the bay, is oyster reefs. Now, oyster reefs are composed by bivalves, and here I really like to present two of the main engineers that we like to call them. This is the Sydney rock oyster, which I'm sure that you guys have seen, hopefully taste. Please consume oysters. And the native flat oyster, which is the Oyster angasi. Now, these two species create reefs, we will share with you in a minute, and they create reefs in different areas. So the Sydney rock oyster is found most in the shallow waters, in the intertidal areas, between high tide and low tide areas, while the Oyster angasi, the native flat oyster, is found in deeper waters. It can be found up to 40 meters in deep. So yeah, there are different species providing different habitats and different kind of like reef forming species. But now, when we talk about oyster reefs, when we talk about shellfish reefs, what are we really talking about? Well, let's have a look first at what is not a shellfish reef. So we see these oysters pretty much everywhere, and I'm sure some of you that utilize the bay a lot would go like, but we see oysters everywhere. We see oysters in rocky reefs, which is not a shellfish reef. It's a rocky reef. Here on the left side of the picture, we're showcasing the La Perouse area with these amazing rock formations that are amazing habitat for many species, and of course they have oysters. We see oysters in pylons, and we see oysters in marinas and ports, and as we see here in the left center picture, we see oysters in seawalls, and we see, well, now less, but we had a really huge oyster aquaculture component in the bay. But this is not a shellfish reef. So then what are we talking about? What really is a shellfish reef? And what would be described as a shellfish reef? Well, the main thing to say what this is an oyster reef is this this habitat composed by really dense aggregations of oysters growing on top of each other. Here we have a vertical cut of this habitat, and as you see, it's composed by hundreds and hundreds of oysters just growing on top of each other by generations. This picture is actually taken in one of the Redman oyster reefs that Botany Bay has, so we still have some bits and pieces left of this habitat, and where we see how this habitat is formed. It's basically composed, is based in sand flats and mud flats, so that they grow. This is where they grow, and as I was saying, it's just composed mainly by shells and bivalves. Now, this picture in the right is just a vertical cut of the picture that we show in the left. So these trees can grow up to 1 to 1.5 meters tall, just by all these oysters just growing eventually on top of each other. Now, if we see that in a different examples, this is what it looks like at a seascape level. We see how these compounds of mounds of oysters just grow, as I was saying, on a sand flat, for example, here intertidally. This is a picture of one Redman Reef in Bermagui. And we see how it's just this cumulus of oysters, similar to what a coral reef would do, but just oysters being the engineers of the habitat. Now, this is a native flat oyster reef. This is what it looks like. Again, these grow in deeper waters, and they don't grow as tall as a thinner rock oyster reef. They just form what we call beds. So the vertical relief is lower, but still you have these huge dense components of oysters. And we have different shellfish. So of course we have all the different species that do shellfish reef. Here we have a little bit of a representation of a thinner rock oyster reef at low tide and at high tide. Here in the left side of the picture, we have a mussel bed, which also come from these beds, dense aggregations called beds. And here in the right bottom, we have another picture of a representation of an Engasi native flat oyster bed. So as I was saying before, this is the habitat, and as a habitat, this has really beneficial ecosystem functions. So we will go through them a little bit. So as you see in the picture, a shellfish is quite a big structure. It's quite a strong structure, and it's really good at attenuating wave energy and protecting the shore and the mudflats from erosion, and reducing that local erosion that can happen in some of the estuaries, as in the case of Botany Bay. Yes, you can imagine this setting an oyster reef in a mudflat will help the mudflat to become stabilized and to become more protected from currents and from that erosion. They're really good at shoreline protection. As you can imagine, oysters are filter feeders. This is how they feed. And the study is saying that a single hectare of a shellfish reef can remove 166 kilograms of nutrient pollution in a year. Now, how does this work? Well, you know, filter feeders, they just take in, oysters will take everything from the water column that can feed through their gills. And by that, they will eat what they can, and they are really smart, and they can actually identify the bits and pieces that they like to eat and the bits and pieces that they don't like to eat, what they don't like to eat, let's say pollution. They just put it in a little bag and then just discard it. And that's how we call the feces. And they just put it back into the sediment. So they're really good at taking whatever is in the water column and putting and storing down below in the sediment. And that's how they remove the pollution. Now, by doing that, they also remove nitrogen. We have this. We can have runoff from our lands. We have runoff from the neighborhoods, and what they do, or the oysters do, is by filtrating the water. As I was saying, they just put these pseudo-feces, this contaminant, these pollutants, this nitrogen in the sediment, and also they put their feces. And their feces, their studies are saying that they're quite nutritious, so they're really good for foraging habitat for other species, especially creatures such as worms. Crabs will feast on the oyster feces, so usually you will find more abundance and more diversity of these invertebrates nearby oyster reefs because they really like to feed on that organic matter, which then attracts fish and birds that will feed upon those little creatures. So they're really good at, at taking that pollutants, taking that nitrogen for the water column, putting in the sediments, and enriching that sand flats and that mud flats within those Redman oyster reefs. And as you can imagine, this is really fantastic at providing habitat for many, many species. We have been doing some research on the past 5 to 10 years in New South Wales and in Australia, and we found that up to 200 species utilize shellfish reefs for food, for refugee, and for nursery. Here we have a fantastic video showing an octopus just crawling onto thinner rock oyster reefs at high tide, and we see just a baby brain just wandering around a cloud of them. So this is just a representation of how great this habitat is for many, many organisms. And we see as well that seagrass, for example, really benefits from these services as well. Seagrass can grow really, really close to oyster reefs because they can feel much, much protected from it. So a fantastic habitat. So if you go by bits and we start talking about invertebrates, little creatures, the studies saying that, for example, thinner rock oyster reefs host 5 times more biodiversity, abundance, density of crabs, worms, invertebrates in general than bare sediments. Now, this is fantastic. And not only that, there's also a spillover effect on the nearby sandflats. So if we find all these creatures hanging around in that reef, that will mean that we also have these creatures hanging around and feeding on the sandflats nearby these reefs. Here we were seeing a fantastic example of the mud crab. They really love shellfish reefs, and we have fantastic footage of mud crabs actually taking the oysters from the reef and eating them. So definitely there's a little bit of predation there, but certainly it's fantastic seeing how animals utilize this habitat. And of course, it's not only mud crabs, it's just everything. We have sworded crabs, we have gastropods, little snails, polychaetes that are really, really, really good for prey for other animals, such as fish. In a similar way, studies saying that we found more than 100 species utilizing oyster reefs as habitat. Again, they feed upon the sediments and the detritus that these reefs provide. They feed upon the oysters. They feed upon other organisms that live on the reef. They use it as nursery for baby juvenile as they feel protected, and of course they use it as refugee from other organisms. So a really, really fantastic habitat for many organisms. Now, often, of course, birds cannot be more than a habitat for them. Here we have a picture of an oyster catcher. As the name says, you would expect that these guys will be found upon oyster reefs. So oyster reefs can provide a direct bird habitat to these species and as roosting habitat as well, because they're kind of like more elevated from the ground. But also they can be, I think we have here an example as well at how bird utilizes habitat at high tide as well. We have those cormorants feeding upon creatures at high tide, which is also really great. And as I was saying, indirectly, we have birds feeding on the sandflats and the mudflats nearby these oyster reefs. Birds that, of course, cannot forage on hard structure. They can feed upon those mudflats that is enriched by the amazing amount of diversity that we can find in nearby places. So really, really good habitat for birds as well. So this is kind of like an overview of the ecosystem services that this habitat is providing. But now we start thinking about, okay, so if this habitat is being so important, why are we talking about restoring it? What happened to it? And of course, we have to go back to us and the uses that we've been given to this habitat in the bay. So from habitat, we have just seen a resource. And here I will just let Charlie or Panner speak about the history of oyster reef and why is the reason that we are restoring them. So with further ado, Charlie, I'll pass you the.
Thanks very much, Paco. Beautiful presentation, some stunning photos there. So just bear with me, folks, while I share my screen to replace Paco's. We'll start that up. Nearly there.
Take your time, Charlie.
That's all good. Getting there. Technology, gotta love it. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. So before I start, I'd actually just like to acknowledge the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation. I'm up here on the north coast, and they're the traditional owners of the country on which I stand today. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and First Nations people here tonight. I'd also just like to bring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders viewers, just note the content warning on this title slide. So as Paco beautifully described, we've got some fantastic functioning oyster reefs in some of our estuaries in New South Wales, including in Botany Bay. So you might be wondering what all the fuss is about and why we're even here this evening and having this presentation. Well, global assessments have actually revealed that there's been a devastating loss of shellfish reefs, such as oyster reefs, oyster beds, across the world's ecoregions. And in fact, shellfish reefs are widely recognised as one of the world's most impacted marine ecosystems. And at the New South Wales scale, and also in Botany Bay itself, this is no different. So as Paco said, to gain a better understanding of why and how shellfish reefs have been so heavily impacted, we can take a deep dive into their history, and that's what I'm going to do here now. So history indicates that shellfish reefs, including natural and native oyster and mussel beds, were once significant dominant features of many estuaries in New South Wales. And it's widely known how important shellfish were for coastal Aboriginal communities as a source of protein for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, but also that these beds provided an important location for cultural gatherings. So the presence of large shell middens, sometimes up to 12 metres high in some locations, in and around the Sydney region, including Botany Bay, provide an indication of just how long Aboriginal occupation has been in those areas, with some dating back to 6,000 years. And in other parts of Sydney, the carbon dating has revealed 14,500 years of occupation prior to European colonisation. So although the scale of consumption over time was significant, it's firmly believed the cumulative impact was relatively benign. And in some areas, there's historical research that's shown that their intimate knowledge of connection to sea country actually allowed Aboriginal communities to enhance the productivity of the beds. So by delving into early colonial history, we can help build a picture of what these natural beds perhaps once looked like, and including in some instances, what species were growing there. So we can look at diary extracts from the 1770 voyage of the Endeavour, and which perhaps provide the very first European accounts of shellfish in Australia in Botany Bay. John Hawksworth, the official record keeper, describes these great quantities of shellfish on large flats of mud and sand. And Cook himself described the largest oyster shells he ever saw. Interestingly, these oysters are likely to be those of the native flat oyster, or Ostrea angusi, which is what Paco talked about earlier with those low profile beds. That's now actually locally extinct in Botany Bay. So with European arrival came the growing need for a readily accessible and nutritious food source, and also a building material. The natural oyster reefs provided both of these in spades, and this heralded the great oyster rush. The lack of limestone quarries and initial construction failings at the fledgling colony at Port Jackson led to a really pivotal light bulb moment in the history of natural oyster beds, and that was the production of lime mortar from shells. So huge quantities of shells, both from middens and, once they were exhausted, from the living oyster beds, which reportedly produced the finest of lime mortar, were burnt to produce lime for construction. And the shipping records, such as these ones that you can see here from the 1803 Sydney Gazette, Ship News and Port News, provide a bit of an indication about the early shipping activity around Botany Bay. And we can see that there's a lot of transport of shells and or lime out of the bay. Early colonial buildings, including first Government House, Hyde Park Barracks, and also Vaucluse House, which is pictured here in the background, were built using the lime mortar or shelly mortar. And some of these buildings still survive today, as we know. So the fledgling colony was literally built on a foundation of oysters. These shells are either transported to a central lime kiln, such as those shown here. So we've got bottom right up Cook's River, and then also here on this old map of the village of Burley, a fishing village that was up on the north of in the bay. It's a lime kiln just there on the map. So they were either burnt in these lime kilns or virtually on the spot in temporary pits, such as described here in this article. So the hunger for oysters didn't stop there. The abundance of these natural oyster reefs also provided a really plentiful, easily accessible, and importantly, a really familiar food source for the European colonists. This led to a boom in oyster saloons. There's one on virtually every street corner in Sydney. And where there wasn't one, there were street vendors selling this delicious food to all sectors of society. And they were quite often sourced from nearby Botany Bay. So this has been described here in this extract from Peter Cunningham's popular 1827 musings on the actual state of society in that colony. And he describes the abundant mud oysters from Botany Bay and the rock oysters, which were collected by poor individuals and sold shelled at 1 shilling a quart. So it just gives a fabulous insight into the consumption of oysters. But Botany Bay wasn't alone. Records show that as the colony expanded, the oyster harvest industry developed in nearly 200 localities across East and South Australia, and literally tons and tons of wild oysters were harvested each year. We can look at some historical maps, and from that we can look at place names, some of which still survive today, and this can give us an insight into where shellfish were harvested and associated activities. So names such as Oyster Bay here on this map, and also Lime Kiln Bay, Lime Kiln Head, just a couple of examples local to the Botany Bay region. So the scale and the pace of natural bed destruction was phenomenal. Oysters were indiscriminately harvested by either dredging, which removed all sizes of oyster, or through direct total removal of the reef. So this backbreaking work was often carried out by convicts in shell gangs using various tools. One of them was a warp stake. And here there's this fantastic quote from the 1821 Principal Superintendent of Convicts, which is a fabulous job title, describing the backbreaking work with men digging for oyster shells in the bed of the river. The labour is severe in itself, and it is frequently performed when they are up to their waists in water. Both live and dead oysters were removed, and importantly, as Paco described earlier, that compacted oyster shell foundation was also removed. And this is really important for the future oyster spat settlement. But this knowledge is not new. In fact, in 1867, Richard Emerson, who was a Sydney oyster saloon proprietor and father of Albert Emerson, who was a founding father of Georges River oyster industry, describes the harvest and the loss of suitable settlement service here in this report to the New South Wales Acclimatisation Society. So he talks about removing the whole of the bed, which in many instances is 6 feet thick of solid shell, leaving nothing to which the spat can attach itself. And thus thousands of bushels of oysters are destroyed and the beds are gradually reduced in size. So it just gives a really amazing insight into the scale of the work and the scale of the loss. So by the mid-1800s, the government of the day realised something had to be done, and the first regulation to manage the oyster beds was introduced. And this was the 1868 Oyster Bed Act, which finally prohibited the burning of live oysters, which you can see in this clause here. However, even after that act came out, reports such as this in the Sydney Mail in 1871 sought to allay any fears that any of the Sydney siders or oyster lovers might have about any lack of supply. They did little to quell the colonists' voracious appetite for oysters. So they describe how Sydney, it is true, need not be at all alarmed for the supply of oysters in her market. For no sooner is the wealth of one river exhausted than the dredgers can turn to another, which has not yet been rifled. So they just moved on and decimated the beds elsewhere. So it's with little surprise that only 10 years after that first act, the irreparable damage led to a Royal Commission, and this was to inquire into the best mode to improve and maintain the natural beds. The Commission received coast-wide reports about the impact on the beds, in which detailed the decline. There's this one here from the Camden Haven, which describes the how at one time that 10, 12, or even 15 boats were employed at one spot. But some few years later, some came back in about 3 years and only got at most 6 or 7 bags a day. So a real decline in productivity of those beds. So the Commission report clearly documented that the natural beds were in dire straits and needed better protection. So a new bill sought to do just this, introducing some new laws to protect the natural beds. But unfortunately, for some estuaries, it was largely too late. The unsustainably high level of exploitation, along with excessive siltation of the estuary caused by land clearing as the colony expanded, industrialization and associated water pollution, and also land reclamation, such as that shown here on this reclamation work, the mudflats of the Cook River, plus increased prevalence of oyster diseases and pests, saw a complete collapse of the natural oyster reef system. This collapse wasn't really an issue for construction endeavours. By then, a source of limestone had been found in the nearby Blue Mountains, and to maintain supply for the consumption, the colony adapted to this loss with a transition to early forms of aquaculture. They did this by depositing substrates such as shell, mangrove stakes and stones to encourage spat settlement, and they often placed them on the site of those original historic natural oyster beds. There were many early attempts that failed. However, a thriving Sydney rock oyster industry has developed in New South Wales from these primitive beginnings. With the rapid pace of development, the colony moved on. The reefs were forgotten. This catastrophic collapse so early in colonial history has led to a phenomenon called generational amnesia. And the oyster reefs have not only been largely lost from coastal ecosystems, but eradicated from human memory. And so where to now in the story of oyster reefs? Well, we're fast forwarding now over a century and we're entering a new era, an era of revival, where we can restore these amazing habitats, these cultural icons, and these rich, diverse seascapes that Paco described earlier. And on that note, I'll hand over to Kirk, and he's going to outline the current Reef Builder proposal, Reef Revival for Botany Bay and Georges River.
Thank you, Charlie. That's absolutely fantastic. And some of that historical information, folks, was brand new to all of us and to me as well. So, Charlie, an amazing job digging into that. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be asking Paco to advance these slides just to make sure that we have a smooth transition here. So bear with me as I do that. Moving now right into the actual project and proposal within Botany Bay. Okay, Paco, thank you. So I'll start with the goal. As Charlie's mentioned here, we've had a tremendous loss of this habitat type and this resource within Botany Bay. The Reef Builder Initiative with the Australian government in partnership with Greater Sydney LLS has a goal for Botany Bay to restore up to 5 hectares of oyster reef. And that will be across 2 species, both the intertidal Sydney rock oysters and the subtidal or deeper water native flat oysters. That's an image here again that you've seen earlier of these native flat oysters. Okay. Of course, as we move into considerations on reef restoration, one of the biggest issues is site selection. And there's been a tremendous amount of work that's gone into this for the project in Botany Bay. This includes analyzing habitat suitability for each of the species of oysters, looking at restoration suitability of each of the individual sites that are available. That takes into account whether or not it's in proximity to a shipping lane, may have aquaculture uses occupying the area, or it could be a boat mooring location or developed foreshore. And then we've also done a fair bit of stakeholder consultation and taken on board any of the advice and concerns of people in the area about what restoration may mean for a locality. Okay. All of those considerations, and more than I have described there, have been put together into a restoration suitability model, which is an attempt to rank the areas throughout the Georges River and Botany Bay for a suitability of trying to bring this habitat type back. You can see the output that's been generated here from unsuitable to highly suitable. So this was produced by Alice Howie, a GIS specialist who has really helped TNC and worked with the partners to produce the habitat suitability modeling for this project and others around the country. From this point, we then selected several areas to investigate and originally ground truth to see if they're suitable for restoration. Taken those sites to our partners and have whittled them down, and the next slide shows the output of what really is a fair bit of work to get to identifying and developing the proposal for 4 different locations within Botany Bay. Now, the rest of my slides will move from right to left, but you can see the locations for the subtitle native flat oysters in Prunell and Tarrant Point. Moving farther up the river, we've got Sydney Rock oyster restoration locations in Coronation Bay and Audrey Bay. Okay. First, I'll walk through each of the sites to give you an idea of what they look like. And as I do that, I guess one of the points I'll make now, and Charlie teed up the reasons for the approach to restoration we're using very well, and mentioning that not only were the oyster beds and oysters themselves removed, but all of the substrate which the oysters settle on was actually taken oftentimes as well. And that's critically important because that in itself is one of the large reasons why these reefs have not been able to reestablish and restore naturally. The site at Prunell is approximately 6 meters deep. This is the location where we will perform native flat oyster restoration. This will be built in 2 stages, we hope. The idea is to trial a pilot build in 2022. I'll talk a little bit more, and then scale that up in 2023. You click the next slide, Paco. As we mentioned, the real impetus and the kickstart for building these reefs is to provide a solid base structure for the oysters to attach and grow on. This is an image of the plan for our reef footprints that we'll be constructing at the subtidal locations. These are 10 meters by 30 meters long, and for the initial pilot build in 2022, we're proposing to build 2 of these reefs to trial the site and see how the suitability works there to further ground truth the suitability modeling that's been performed. Next slide, Paco. That gives you an idea on scale. The pilot is quite small. These 2 reefs are dwarfed in that 6-hectare selected area, but that'll give us a start on assessing how the approach is working. After these reef bases are built, we'll actually be seeding them with native flat oyster spat that is settled on oyster shell. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on. Next slide. So moving a little bit further into the bay to Tarrant Point, we've got our second subtitle, native flat oyster reef area. Here you can see its proximity to some areas that were excluded. These are mooring sites. So again, we're getting more into the human dimensions here and fitting the restoration into the current landscape. Next slide, Paco. And at this site, we're also proposing to build 2 pilot reefs to trial the site and further ground truth how these areas perform as we see them with native flat oysters. Okay, go ahead. Moving into the Georges River, quite a ways upstream, and into the first Sydney Rock oyster site. These again are intertidal reefs. So the work that's done here is built between the high and low tide. This area is approximately 2 hectares in size, and the next slides will show some pictures of this area. This is a site where some of that historic rock substrate oyster aquaculture was performed. So if you look at this image in the background, you can see some of the large rocks that were placed here to grow oysters for harvest for human consumption. The next slide shows that as well. You can see the linear rows of rocks that were placed here to actually grow oysters. The work we'll be doing will augment this habitat type and expand the area where oysters can settle and grow to increase the ecosystem services that they provide. Next slide. We're looking now at a plan form of the Coronation Bay site. We've got 2 areas of oyster reef patches that we're proposing to restore at this location. Again, this will be done in 2 stages. So the upper right patch would be built out within the pilot stage and expanded in the following year in the lower area. Next slide, please. Moving up to our last location, this is up in the Audrey Bay. I believe it's the Warrenora River. I may mispronounce that. I apologize if I have. The site is a beautiful hard-packed sand flat of about 1.5 hectares in size. You can see an image of it looking downstream here. The next shot, I believe, is looking upstream. Again, this is an intertidal area for the Sydney Rock oyster restoration, and our plan form images are shown in the next slide, where we'll be building the rock reef bases at this location, again in 2 phases, one at the lower portion of the screen, and the second phase that build out will be the upper section of reefs. Now, if you look at the designs there, what we've actually done, these are just, I guess, conceptual plans, but these are actually images of reef that were taken from out in Goodray Bay. So some of the remnant reefs that are available in Botany Bay were used to model the size and the shape of these restored reef bases, to give you an idea of how we've come to that concept plan for consultation. Okay, next slide. So that's a little bit about the actual sites, the proposed footprint of the build. I thought it would be nice to give a little bit of background on how we actually make that construction happen. What does it look like and how is it performed? I find that to be very interesting, and it makes a big part of what we actually do in these restoration projects. So again, we've got 2 stages planned for 2022 and 2023. Let's go ahead and slide to the next one. And of course, there's 2 different approaches really for the build. And I'll start by talking about intertidal Sydney Rock oyster reef construction, and then we'll talk about the steps that are involved in subtidal native flat oyster restoration processes. As the pictures here show, we're really talking about that heavy construction. It's much the same as any large construction project would be, with the added component and complexity of working on water. This is doubly true when we work in intertidal regions. If you go to the next slide, Paco. This time lapse shows you a little bit of the demand that's placed on the contractors as we do these works. This shows the fact that not only are we working on water, we're also working in an area that goes completely dry twice a day and only allows access with a heavily laden barge for a very short period of time. So a coordination of the contractor arriving on site at the right time is important, and they have a very limited time to perform that work when they get there. This is actually stock imagery from the Port Stephens Oyster Reef Restoration Project, which was run by DPI Fisheries under the Marine Estate Management Strategy. And the second year of that project, TNC was able to partner and provide some funding assistance. But that's been a tremendous project that DPI Fisheries has led, and the monitoring there is coming up with some fantastic results. So that's a really exciting one to show and use as an example for what we're trying to achieve in Botany Bay. Next slide, Paco. Give you an idea of what these projects look like at a large scale from the air. It's nice to do this with an intertidal oyster reef. It's a little harder to show these subtidal reefs at scale, but the shots here show one of the restored sites at Port Stephens. The next slide is just a different angle of that same location. Really mimicking what we find in the remnant oyster reefs, quite a natural appearance, and sorry, there's another one there, and a real boost to the habitat structural complexity in the location. And early monitoring results that Fisheries has conducted at this site, again, has shown a tremendous settlement of oysters in the first 9 months post-project. They had 50 million oysters settle on these reefs, and they were filtering up to 400,000 liters of water an hour. So those provide an example of what we're looking to achieve, and also some very good indications that this restoration approach is working well. All right, moving next. Moving into the subtidal reef bases, again, they're built using a large platinum equipment and barges, but the native flat oysters, as Charlie mentioned, are functionally extinct or potentially completely extinct in Botany Bay. So there's an added step for those reefs of seeding them. We actually have to work with the Port Stephens Fisheries Institute to seed oyster shell with Angazi spat, and that shell with the baby oysters on it will be taken out and placed on the constructed oyster reefs to establish that population and kickstart the restoration of those oyster reefs. What we lack in the ability to show the subtidal reefs at scale, they make up for in the fact that they display just an amazing biodiversity. You can see shots here are courtesy of the Port Phillip Bay project that Simon has been working on for some time now, and really just a lovely view of what it looks like at these subtidal reef sites. Okay. Now we've got a desired schedule that we're working towards. Obviously, a project of this scale and this complexity has a lot of approvals that it needs to work through, and we're currently making headway on that. Everything going to plan. We'd like to construct the pilot reefs in Botany Bay and the Georges River during March and April of 2022. Obviously, we'll be monitoring those sites and looking for adaptive management changes to the approach we're using over the next year approximately, and then scaling that build up in March and April of 2023. So that really, folks, that's a lot of information about the history and ecosystem services that oyster reefs provide. Just to recap why we're going through all of this and the goals that we're trying to achieve in restoring reefs here is to improve the health of the environment within Botany Bay and help stimulate ecosystem recovery for this lost habitat type. Obviously, there's some fantastic financial and economic benefits doing a project like this in an area with lots of local job creation, increased biodiversity, and there's a lot of opportunities for recreational use of these sites as well. So with that in mind, I will go ahead and turn over. I think we've had a few questions come in, and we'll do a question and answer. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time and joining us tonight.
Excellent. I've got some questions floating in, and I've been answering a few as they come in. There was a question early on, and I'll direct this to you, Paco. The question was from Clint. How does the health of the bay oysters compare to Bermagui?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you for that. So I've been lucky to be on a team of researchers monitoring reefs across New South Wales. And I must say that the health of Botany Bay Renman intertidal scenic rock oyster reef is really, really, really good. In fact, in terms of fish habitat provision, it's one of the best places where we find highest richness of species if you compare it with other systems in New South Wales. So the density of oysters of those Renman reefs looks really great. As I was saying before, one of the Renman reefs that we have in the bay is actually one of the tallest that we can find pretty much in New South Wales. So we really have treasures in Tora Point Reserve that have been surviving through the years and came up to still providing the services that they still do. So it's really fantastic. At the beginning when we started, we really weren't sure about how the health of the system, how those Renman reefs were ecologically functioning in New South Wales. But the more we find and the more research we do, the greatest resources we're finding. So yeah, actually quite good.
Excellent. There's another question here which I answered. I'm happy for the team to expand on. How will this affect the seagrass in the area? My answer to that was that as part of our site selection process, we make sure there isn't any seagrass in the areas that we're going to restore. we built in buffers to the existing seagrass beds. However, there is plenty of evidence, particularly in the US, when you restore shellfish reefs, it improves water quality and clarity, and the seagrass can recolonize certain areas. But I don't know if Kirk or if you have any other like to expand on that at all.
Very happy to expand. I think that's a fairly comprehensive answer, Simon. So I won't add too much to it, other than to say that we did move our sites as we ground truth them based on what we found for the current distribution of seagrasses. So that again, as we're doing these site suitability studies and then moving out and ground truthing them, that was one of the considerations we took in designing the reef footprints. And that's critical as we know. Seagrass is protected under legislation within New South Wales, and it's a key fish habitat. So where we're trying to improve habitat diversity and ecosystem function, we certainly don't want to destroy other key habitats in the area. So it's a key consideration for the project design.
And just to add a little bit, what we hope is that this restoration at a scale will actually improve the regeneration and the protection and conservation of Posidonia, for example, another species that is in danger at the moment. And we hope that we can have that symbiosis of multiple habitats being, I guess, working towards the recovery at the same time. Absolutely.
Great. There's a question from Erwin. Will the oyster's growth be interrupted if the mud on the riverbed is frequently disturbed? I said from a subtitled native flat oyster perspective that sedimentation may be an issue, but it's part of the reason why we build our reef bases up to 0.5 metre off the seabed to help sort of counteract those sort of pressures. But from a Sydney rock oyster perspective, or any other comments around that, Kirk?
Yeah, happy to build that. We do see sedimentation in the intertidal area, but one of the nice things that happens after a flood event or in those habitats is we get a lot of wave energy to come back through and flush those sediments back off of the reef. So the term, we call sediment refocusing, which tends to happen naturally. But the fact that the oyster beds again are raised off of the surrounding surface area allows for that wind and tidal action to actually clean a large portion of the sedimentation off. But nonetheless, there are conditions and situations where heavy sedimentation would and can smother an oyster reef. So once again, that's one of the considerations we take on board as we're looking at site selection to ensure we're building in areas that are neutral for both erosion and accretion when it comes to what sediment transport appears to be happening in the location at the time. Great question. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for your patience, everyone. I'm slowly getting to all the questions. Certainly appreciate them. One from Kalinda. If some of these oyster species can grow reefs up to 1 metre tall, how long will it take these reefs to grow to that size? Another excellent question.
Yeah, it will really take time to grow that height. We have to say that this restoration project is on the long term, and the reefs won't look as the pictures we've shown for a long time, but we hope that with close monitoring, we can get to that in I guess, it will take decades pretty much to get that thick layer of shell on top of each other. Just take into account that usually a senior rock oyster will take into maturity over a year. So, we have multiple generations of those adult populations being, settled on top of those traits to get into that full restore habitat that we have seen on the pictures.
I'll just add to that a little bit if I can, Paco. So there's been a bit of research linking in with potential impacts of climate change and sea level rise. So where they've been looking at the vertical accretion of reefs. So that's where it has that upwards growth that we're talking about here. And they've done cores on some old historic reefs and then some that have been recently restored. So those results are showing that the new reefs kind of, get kick-started and have a rapid amount of vertical growth, so up to about 12 centimetres a year, which is quite substantial when you think of the size of an oyster. But then that slows down as the reef ages, and so you're looking at about 2 or 3 centimetres per year when they get, about 10 years old. So as Paco said, it will take time, but we should see rapid growth, colonisation, recruitment at the start, and then that will slow down and consolidate, and we'll get the live oyster band is only the top couple of centimetres on the reef.
We have a great question from Maria Vozzo. Hello, Maria. Do you expect the flat oyster reefs and Sydney rock oyster reefs to provide similar ecosystem services, for example, habitat and food resources for fish?
Okay, that's a
You'd like to
question
answer
for
that
me.
Yeah.
Great question, Maria. Thank you for asking. Yes, in fact, TNC has been restoring native flat oyster reefs for a couple of years now, and we've been monitoring those reefs, and we have seen, for example, in Port Phillip Bay and in WA, an increase of fish since the first deployment of the reef. That doesn't mean that the productivity will increase. That will take some time, but certainly over the years we've seen an increase of, for example, baby snapper in Port Phillip Bay and other commercial and recreational species around the restored reefs. So certainly we hope to see an increase of diversity, richness, and abundance of fish species around the reef. Even whether it's in rock of native flat oyster, absolutely we'll see an increase, and then our partners and us will monitoring that reef for years. So then we will see how the richness is increasing towards the baseline level of what a Redman oyster reef will provide.
This is an online community forum.
Yeah.
I'll follow up and continue with that. We'll see water filtration by the oysters in both species, and there's definitely a similarity in ecosystem services that are provided there, but there are some differences just based on the different habitat types. So the deeper water of the native flat oysters facilitate a different suite of species. Paco mentioned one that's really popular. Baby snapper seem to really love oyster reefs in these deeper areas. What we're seeing in the monitoring from Port Stephens, for example, with Sydney rock oyster restoration is we have a real influx of bream, so different fish species that are utilizing those areas for a food resource and natal habitat. So there are some differences. Another one is, we've got stabilization of sediments and wave attenuation with the subtidal reef to some degree, but you generate a different type of habitat and bank protection with these intertidal reefs, which is another one of the ecosystem services they provide. So while we do see similar benefits in increased biodiversity and abundance from both reef types, we see a different suite of species colonizing and utilizing the two habitat types. So that's a great question. You've got a background in ecology, I have a feeling. So you put us to the test. Thank you.
That's what I love about these community forums is the questions that emerge. It's fantastic. Got a question from Bill Anthony. Is there any intention for regeneration further up Georges River?
I'll go ahead and field that one to start with. We've got, a fairly ambitious project that we're looking to deploy over the next 2 years in Botany Bay. We hope that we find positive results and success with the pilot and scale build, and that really is going to inform how we move forward. So the potential for expanded oyster reef restoration in Botany Bay and in the Georges River is great. There's a lot of areas that could utilize this type of treatment. There's potential for true landscape scale restoration throughout the area, but there's also considerations of all of the restrictions around boating use. It's a contemporary landscape. It's got threatened species such as some birds in the areas that we've got to be very conscious of working with and ensuring that all stakeholders that involved are satisfied and happy with the way things progress. So it's not a simple answer, but we hope to expand on the work that we're displaying here, and we will be adaptively managing what we find, and we'll be learning through this process and hopefully finding ourselves working further into the future, building more reefs.
Got a question here from Clinton. Kirk, do you mind just giving a quick recap about the prospective sites? Clinton missed that part of your presentation.
Absolutely. We'll go back. to this site here. So there was a, Clinton, we went through a fairly extensive process to model suitability of locations for restoration, taking in a lot of considerations around constraints from contemporary uses of the waterway. And what we've settled on, and we're working with community consultation, are the 4 locations shown here, working from right to left at Grinnell, nearly in the center of Botany Bay, for 1 6-hectare area of subtidal oyster reef restoration. Tarrant Point, we've got about 2 hectares of subtidal native flat oyster habitat we're proposing to restore, and then the 2 Sydney rock oyster restoration sites are up the Georges River here, shown in purple, at Coronation Bay and at Albury Bay. So those are the areas, the prospective areas we're proposing to work over the next 2 years on this project.
Great. So I'm just doing a quick look at the questions. I want to make sure we get to all of them. I'm going to see if I can lump them all. But there's one question here from John. Once these reefs have been scaled up in 2023 to the full 6 hectares, is that the limit in scale of the area of the reefs going forward, or will the reefs grow naturally outwards from these starting locations and ultimately grow much larger than the 6 hectares?
They'll be limited largely there by the footprint of the hard reef structure that we put down for them to grow on. Is probably the best answer. We know that they can grow almost glacially slowly and expand in a Sydney rock oyster context. We'll see these reefs expanding their footprint, and you can get a sense of that growing much like a coral reef would grow from its point of origin. But as far as really expanding out at a rapid pace from the area that we plan to work, it's unlikely we'll see that happening at a pace any of us on the call today would be around for, if that makes sense. It's a very slow process for that to occur, so it's unlikely to grow much beyond the areas that are worked in actively. The restoration process that we're going through now and the permitting process takes in all of the areas we're showing, and we're proposing to restore up to 5 hectares within that footprint. But it can be noticed if you add up the total area that's in these 4 sites, it's close to 12 hectares of habitat that could be restored if they were built out completely. We're just seeking, with the current funding we have now, to achieve up to 5 hectares of reef restoration over the next 2 years. So that's a little more background on the areas that are selected and where we're proposing to go at the time.
And I guess to just build up on that fantastic answer, Kirk, research from Macquarie University in Sydney has shown that the current limiting factors of recruitment on the natural populations of oysters in New South Wales are the lack of substrate. That's why we are putting back a rocky substrate for the oysters to attach, but also is predation, and that's why we use rocks from different shapes and forms to create protection areas for the oysters to attach and not be predated by the pesky bream. But then, like, that's one of the main reasons why we are not seeing a natural regrowth of those oyster reef, for example, in the bay. It's just one, because we don't have that natural substrate. So without that, we wouldn't have an increase on shellfish reef, but also by all this predation that the oysters are suffering at the moment in New South Wales.
I've just skipped forward a little bit in the questions, but I'll jump back to them. I might throw this one to Nerida. Question from KC. I'm wondering about consultation and involvement of the traditional owners in the project or in the future. For example, the Gamay Rangers at La Perouse. Maybe I'll throw that to you, Nerida. Oh, you're on mute. Maybe while Nerida's getting her mute sorted, maybe I'll hand over to you, Paco, for a sec.
Sure, yes. And I also saw a question about the Georges River Keeper. We have been having conversations with both Georges River Keeper and the May Rangers. We certainly would like to start having collaborations among these fantastic groups, and hope that we can get some citizen science going on, involvement for opportunities for volunteering, and be part of certainly this project. This is a really long-term kind of like project. So certainly they are really good at. They've been happy with the project. We have really good feedback from these groups, and at the moment, we will start having conversations about how we collaborate and provide more citizen science and involvement opportunities for these groups. Absolutely.
Great, thanks, Paco. There's a question here from Marina. Are there any areas with high natural recruitment? If so, are there plans to put out unseeded substrate before the oyster breeding season to compare these against seeded areas? That's a really good question. I'll maybe throw that to you, Kirk.
Yeah, I'll start with that, and I think Paco can probably help back up the answer here. As far as the high areas of oyster settlement and recruitment, we know at present the areas in Quibre Bay and further out around Terran Point have excellent habitat and natural remnant oyster reefs. Now, this is in part due to the fact that there is very, very good oyster catch in those areas and spat fall, as it's coined in the industry. So those locations we know are highly suitable both for restoration and for remnant reefs. There are limitations there on where we can currently work around the marine reserves, and at this point we haven't proposed to work in those locations, but we do know that those are areas where oyster spat fall is very high and survival of the oysters is very high as well. I'll let Paco follow up more. He's done a full PhD of research on the habitats and the oysters in the bay, so he's best placed.
Sounds good. Thanks, Marina. And definitely, we have been integrated. That's one of the parameters that we have integrated in the restoration suitability model. So Alice Howe, as part of the biological factors to input on that model, was what was the distance to remnant populations, so then we can get that recruitment on our sites. But yes, as unfortunately, as Kate mentioned, at the moment, especially for Sydney Rock sites, which is the only ones that are apparently remnant in the bay, our sites are a bit far away, but certainly we have oysters, as you saw, in different urbanized environments in the bay, that we hope that we can get that recruitment on our substrates as well.
And of the native flat oyster, there's very few remaining left in Botany Bay, so we might get some really low level of natural recruitment, but primarily the oysters will be from the hatchery, seeded onto oyster shells. But over time, as the project grows, we do hope to rebuild the population base of native flat oysters in Botany Bay as well. Got a question for you, Charlie, from Beth. In a paper that the Georges Riverkeeper produced around the history of oysters in Georges River in the Bay, I believe that water quality was a stressor on the oysters. I know that oysters are supposed to help with water quality, but is the water quality good enough at the moment to facilitate growth and survival?
That's a really great question, and I think we can draw on those lovely images that Paco had to really answer that question. So yes, water quality is impacted in the bay. We know that. It's we're dealing with a contemporary estuary. We've had industrialization. We've had various impacts up in the catchment. So there is water quality issues that go on in Botany Bay. But as Paco showed, there is still healthy functioning oyster reef. We are still getting oysters recruiting naturally in the bay, in the wild. So the water quality is good enough for them to survive and thrive. And bringing more oysters back into the bay is only going to improve water quality. There's work like what Nerida and the Greater Sydney Local Land Services do in and around the catchment, which is contributing holistically to improving the bay. And this is the oyster reef restoration is just one component really of improving the health of Botany Bay.
Yeah, and I guess also research has been finding that actually the oysters, the native populations of Sydney Rock oysters in the bay have become more resistant to the QX, for example, than in other estuaries. So we actually the populations that we have left are actually quite strong. That's why one of the main reasons as well. That's why we are relying on natural recruitment for the Sydney Rock oysters, is because the native populations there are quite strong and quite resilient. So we hope that we can get them in our restoration projects. There will be losses, of course, and the QX is something that is with us and is in the Georges River. So there's no way that dissipate and eliminate that limiting factor. But certainly we will relying on the health and resilience of those senior rock oyster superheroes that are still left in the bay.
Great. Thanks for all the supportive comments that are coming through as well. We certainly very much appreciate them. We've got quite a topical question here around reef design. It's something that we talk about internally quite a bit, well, both TNC and DPI and others. What is the basis for the irregular shape of the footprint of the native flat oyster beds or reefs?
If I can, I know that everybody's going to jump in and want to answer this one, but I get there first. One of the things we know from research on all types of habitat, really, but also from studies on oyster reefs particularly, is that the edge of the habitat, so the edge interface of a patch of oyster reef, tends to have the highest biodiversity and abundance of species. So by creating an irregular pattern around the build, we expand that surface area, or we expand the edge habitat in relation to the size of the patch, if you will. So the idea of the irregular shape is to increase that area available for biodiversity, but it also serves to break up currents and provide micro habitats and niche spaces for oysters to survive, but also for other organisms to colonize and utilize this structural habitat. So the more complexity and for a technical term, rugosity, we can put into these reef bases, the more we expect to see different species utilizing them and taking advantage of the unique habitats that those spaces provide.
Thanks, Kirk. I see, Nerida, you have you can talk now. Would you like to add any further comments around our
sorry, the microphone
consultation with traditional owners?
Yes. Yes, consultation with La Perouse local Aboriginal Land Council started a number of months ago. La Perouse local Aboriginal Land Council is heavily involved with other projects that we have currently going on at Tower Point, and the Gamma Rangers have been particularly supportive of an Aboriginal Green Team working over at the National Park's Ramsar site. So to build on that concept, we've given a presentation to the La Perouse Aboriginal Land Council, and they are now heavily involved in planning what their involvement might be from the Western science point of view. Our Aboriginal officer is also looking at expanding right down to the coast and out to Gandangara Land Council to find out what cultural connections we can build intrinsic to the Oyster project. So consultation we're undergoing that at this stage, and those communities will advise of which directions to go in to get the most out of connecting with this project.
Thanks, Nerida. Got a question from Evan. I'll just summarise it. Basically supporting the project, considering that we're sort of bringing back a lost ecosystem. Why is it so hard to get, I guess, permits for a project such as this? Who would like to answer that one?
Leave it to Kirk.
Look, I'll answer that one. And really, there's not a concise answer there, but what I can say is that the legislation that is in place to protect our habitats treats a restoration project with the same lens that would any other proposal. So we're essentially meeting the same bar that a development proposal to put in a marina or develop a boat ramp would face. And there are good and bad things about that. What it does mean is that we have to take a very rigorous approach to project design, extensive consultation, and at the end of the day, it raises our game to ensure that as restoration practitioners, we're putting forward a project that has stood up to scrutiny, essentially, both under legislation, but also from everybody in the community, both on the regulatory side, but also from a research standpoint around the biological applicability and suitability of the proposal to meet the desired outcomes. So it's incredibly hard, I will admit. The approvals pathway for this is a challenge, but it's a challenge that we can overcome, and projects like this have been successful. So we're looking forward to making it happen here as well.
Thanks, Kirk. And there's a question from Rob. Will this webinar be available for reviewing? Yes, we will circulate the recording to everyone that's RSVP'd for this event. So more than happy to do that. Question for you, Charlie. What can be done to facilitate the deployment of these types of restoration projects?
Thanks, Simon. Great question. So is there any, is that community involvement? Does the question say? Or
no, it's a question from
no?
Evan,
Okay.
but I guess it's just maybe how do we get more of these projects off the ground in other areas in New South Wales, maybe?
Yeah, fantastic and great question. And obviously, you know, the reason we're all here tonight, this community engagement and sharing that story of shellfish reefs in New South Wales and their loss is just so important and really key, because as I said in the presentation, it really is a lost, you know, it's a lost and forgotten ecosystem. So people...
And sorry, Charlie, it is for the community. I just got...
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Evan. I can see that there in the chat. So yeah, you know, bringing the community on board and along and participating is really key to getting a successful project. At the end of the day, it's contemporary estuaries. People live, work, breathe, you know, have fun in our coastal estuaries, and they're also the eyes and ears of our estuaries. So it's, you know, it's really great to tap into any local knowledge. There's lots of different ways that we're doing this through, you know, through the project here in Botany Bay, but across the coast under the Marine Estate Management Strategy project. So we're keen to hear from communities who may have seen shellfish reefs. We're trying to build a picture of where there's current reef in New South Wales, and that's really important for, you know, a number of perspectives for delivering a shellfish reef restoration project. Ultimately, we need to know what we've still got, if anything. So there's a shellfish reef reporter. You can Google that, shellfish reef reporter, and that's a really great little app. You can go in and contribute any sightings you've got of shellfish reefs, and then, you know, bringing up local projects, you know, getting on board and yeah, finding out what's going on in your local estuary is really fantastic. When we've got projects underway, you know, there's many ways that communities can get engaged. Citizen science is a really key one. So there's opportunities at some projects to assist with the monitoring. We're developing up a project to do just that on the south coast, and that, you know, that's really fabulous, having those extra volunteers and extra insights into yeah, how well the restoration's going. So there's I guess there's a number of routes for communities to get involved. Sharing the story is a really great way. You know, there's many people out there who still don't know about shellfish reefs, and helping to build support in the community, which is called, you know, building social license, for getting a project like this underway in your local area, is a really great place to start.
Thank you. Lots of questions flooding in. We're getting close to, we've got another 7 minutes. So I'll just have a quick one I'll throw to you, Kirk. There's a couple of questions around Kurnell. First around, it's quite a deep site. Is Kurnell within the container shipping channel, and how big are we building the reef there? Maybe talk a little bit about the site selection at Kurnell, what went into that.
Absolutely, that's a great question, and you're right. It is smack bang in the middle of a very busy shipping channel. Our original site was a little shallower, around 4 meters in depth, and one of the early processes for site selection is consultation with all of the agencies. This includes Transport for New South Wales and the maritime officers that are in charge of boating safety and running the port, Botany. So with consultation from them, looking at the risks posed by potential storm events and large ships on low tides and every scenario you could paint. We moved the restoration location into this deeper water. So the location is 6 meters deep. The reef's top will be no more than 50 centimeters from the surrounding substrate when we construct them. So that leaves 5.5 meters of water depth over the site, which is deemed sufficient by maritime to be safe for navigation. So I guess that's some of the background on how those concerns are addressed and ensured that there is safety in the way that these proposals are put forward. The Terran Point site is a little shallower. It's around 3 meters in depth, but it's in a location outside of the shipping area or shipping channels, and it's outside of the marked navigation channel as well. So it's lower risk, and it's also near boat mooring locations, which generally have slower moving boat traffic as well. So that was taken into consideration.
And just a quick one, Kirk, around Cornell. What about the reef design and orientation of the reefs, considering it's more exposed site compared to Terran Point?
Absolutely. So this is one of the areas that we're all very interested in. It's a complex space to look at the hydrodynamics of a reef interaction with the substrates around it. We are interested in monitoring that very closely. The idea was to set the reefs in parallel with the proposed flow, both tidal movements and wave swell energy, to reduce the exposure of the reefs to all that energy, I guess, and reduce the potential scour and changes around the site. But that is one of the aspects that we're learning with the project, and the reason why we go slowly and take a small pilot stage before we build a large scale project at a location like Cornell.
And in 2021, at least for the subtidal reefs, it is difficult to find locations considering the constraints and the amount of boat movements in the bay. So that kind of went into it as well. I've got a question around Coronation Bay. There's a shellfish reef in Oatley Bay across the river. Was this reviewed?
I'll field that one first. Yeah, that's a great observation. There is a very nice example of reef there. There's a few raised oyster beds, actually, that were some of the early aquaculture in that area. And I believe you might be referring to Never Fail Bay in the Oatley Bay area. If not, it's very close to it. What Charlie had mentioned, and I'll let her expand on this, is there's been a fairly extensive effort by New South Wales DPI Fisheries to map the existing intertidal oyster reefs. And that data is being compiled and put together by them now. And the mapping that was performed within Botany Bay and the Georges River did capture those reefs. So I was part of that data collection at that time with DPI Fisheries, and we did notice those reefs there. So they've been recorded as extant, but we haven't studied them at depth per se, if that helps put some context on it.
And just a question from Linda, who also asked around the canal and the proximity to the shipping channel. Just wondering why it's called Canal. Isn't Canal part of the 3 ports SEP Port Botany? SEPP Port Botany. I don't know if you have any.
I don't know.
We'll take that on notice.
Yeah,
I guess it's, you know, like as Kirk was explaining, the site was very close. Like I guess it's part of the historical succession of our site selection. The reef was originally placed very close to Cornell, right in the fringe of the seagresses, of course leaving a buffer to it. But then with the succession of agencies and community engagement and opportunities and workshops, we have been the site has been drifting towards, I guess, the port area and the middle of the bay. So internally, we call it Cornell. Certainly, you know, we hope that we can name the site when we start restoring, when we start putting the reefs in the water. We will certainly provide a much, you know, comprehensive name to the sites that have a more like naming kind of like convention. But yeah, sorry for that. Cornell is just, yeah, it's just how we call it historically because it was closer to Cornell.
And I'm just answering sort of Linda here. Yes, we did sort of engage closely with the Port of Botany, Transport for New South Wales, around that site, and the site was shifted to make sure that it was at least 6 meters of water and it wasn't in a transit route. The original site where we had it wasn't within a shipping channel, but it was an informal channel that boats used, and there was some concern that in rough weather that the site wasn't deep enough. So that's why we've shifted it out to 6 meters in depth to satisfy the Port of Botany, Transport for New South Wales. I don't know, is there anyone else that we got? Linda's saying you mentioned Port Authority, but not New South Wales Ports. So
we engage with the operations managers of the Port Authority in connection with the operations manager of Transport for New South Wales. Certainly, the site is very close to the main port shipping channel, but it doesn't go in the shipping channel. I don't think that would be allowed by ports, certainly. So yeah, we involve the local organisms in the bay, and we certainly those were one of the suggestions of that we had was just posting this site in deeper water. Certainly, it's away of the shipping channel. It's not part of the shipping channel, just to make sure of that. But yeah, we haven't engaged with New South Wales Ports itself, but certainly with Port Botany and Transport for New South Wales Maritime.
Yeah, there will be an advisory that's put out for construction in advance of any works that are done. So we will be directly consulting with all of the agencies again as we go through the final steps of approval, and then advertising notices to all boat users and waterway users, including Port Botany and the Port Authority, as we go into a construction mode. So that's part of the requirements under the approval process, and certainly what we need to do to keep everyone safe.
And Linda, listen, if you have any more advice around that, more than happy for you to send us an email. But we're sort of engaging with everyone that we need to as part of the permitting process, and also obviously tonight with the community. Noting that it's 6:30, and I think I've covered off on all the questions. Apologies if I have missed any. I'm happy to stay online for a bit and answer any final ones, but I'll probably hand back to you, Kirk, to wrap up.
Yeah, look, thank you so much, everyone. That's fantastic engagement. I'm really thrilled with all the questions and interest. I think we received a lot of really good questions that show people care and are paying attention to what's going on in Port Botany. And it looks like a lot of people are quite excited by the proposed project. So that's wonderful feedback to hear. And we're happy to take on any other comments or feedback you may have. So please feel free to be in touch, and we will love to hear from you if you have any further questions going forward. But I just want to say thank you and appreciate your time and enjoyed the opportunity to present to you.
Wonderful. I'm just putting my email address in the comments here if anyone has any extra questions. And like I said, more than welcome to email me any further advice, Linda.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful night. I think we'll call that a wrap, and we'll take any other comments offline if they come through. Really appreciate it, guys. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, good stuff.